We are delighted to have you back, and part of this conversation, we'll go through the presentation and then we'll have time for question and answer. You do have a chat box. If you want to list your questions there, we'll be able to access that at the end of the webinar. We are delighted to have Allison Douglas here with us today. She is part of the Harmony Family Center, is a parent herself, and has done all kinds of training on how to serve children and youth with a history of trauma. So last time we talked about what adverse childhood experiences, adverse teenage experiences are, and how that affect us physically and for our brains, as well as developmentally and behavioral. So kind of looking today at how do we sort through all that, and what are some tips and suggestions that we can use in working with children and teens from experiences of adverse experiences and history of trauma. So Allison, thank you for being here. Do want to start us off with a word of prayer. Let us pray. A loving and gracious God, we thank you for this day. We're grateful that we can share and learn with one another. We're grateful for the gifts and skills, experiences that you've given Allison, so that she can lead us and share us with very practical ways that we can be a ministry in our churches and in our communities. Instill us with wisdom, with guidance, and inspiration, and new possibilities. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Allison, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you share. And any other part of the introduction you want to share, please do that as well. But thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate that. And I love that in your prayer, you've talked about new possibilities. That's such a lovely way to think about learning something new. Not that we have been doing something incorrect or wrong, but simply that there are new possibilities in ways that we can effectively minister and serve kids and youth and their families, because it all comes together really in many ways. And so I just appreciate that very much. As you said, I'm Allison Douglas. I am the Resource Center Program Manager at Harmony. And the way that I came to this position and this work really is that I had spent the first part of my career as a Montessori teacher, working in the classroom with kids, and I thought I was pretty good at that until I didn't know I was not so great at being with kids all the time, because my husband and I moved to Knoxville and became foster parents. And our plan, which we all know what God does with our plans. Our plan was to serve foster kids and reunite those families for 10 years and then be done and out of there, and think, you know, we've done our part. But as you can see from the photograph there at the bottom, we ended up adopting 4 kids. This is a fairly old photograph. Now my kids are 18, 14, 10, and 12. But, you know, that plan of 10 years did not work out as I thought it would, because apparently once you are a parent, it lasts forever. So there's no ducking out at 10 years at this point. So we became foster parents, and with my background in education, what I really found was that I did not have the knowledge that I needed to really effectively work with kids who had trauma in their background. Like I said, I thought I was a pretty good teacher. But what I kept finding is that the kids who were coming to live with me had challenges and behaviors that were quite different than most of the kids that I had worked with in the past. And so it afforded me, as Susan said, this new opportunity for learning. And what I learned was about trauma. And so I started pursuing work with kids and families who had trauma in their background and ended up at Harmony. And so I've worked at Harmony 2 separate times, but all together for about 8 years now, and have become certified in the neurosequential model of therapeutics, as well as the neurosequential model in education. And so I will spend lots of time talking about those things. However, I'll spend lots more time just telling you stories, because at heart, I'm a kindergarten teacher, and that's how we learn, is through storytelling. So before we really start, one thing that's important for me to know is just kind of where everyone is in your heart, in your mind, in your spirit, just where you're at. And this will help me to focus in on working this hour and a half to to suit your needs. So I would like for everyone to just go into the chat box. And if you don't know where it is, you'll just find your little taskbar and go to chat, and you can chat to everyone. And if you will just type in that box your rose and your thorn for the past week or so. So your rose would be something that's working beautifully, something that's going well for you, something that is meeting the mark. And then your thorn is going to be that thing that is bugging you, that thing that keeps coming up and causing challenges or problems or anxiety. And this will just be real quick. If we can just take the next about 3 minutes, if you'll type your rose and your thorn in the chat box. So Kristen says spending time with her family has been a rose. It's a good thing. I see lots of being able to be with friends and family again, being able to be with our colleagues again. And thorns, gosh, feel like a lot of uncertainty about school, a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next with COVID. Yes, Sue Lynn, working from home is such a thorn for me too. It's really challenging. I just need people to feel regulated. Lots of change and uncertainty. Yes, Ashley, I'm with you, girl. Yes. Well, I appreciate that. You can keep them coming if you'd like. I think it really just helps us to know that we're all in a place of change and uncertainty, and that impacts how we interface with new material and new ideas. And so please take care of yourself. If you need to get up and stretch and move, even if your camera is on, I'm fine with that. I think in this environment of a lot of change and a lot of shifts, we need to take good care of ourselves, both physically and mentally, so that we can care for other people, right? We can't give what we don't have. And so even though we may have infinite love and infinite care for the people that we minister to, in that, whatever capacity we're doing it, our bodies and brains just can't keep going sometimes. And so please take care of yourself, ask questions, and just know that we're in this together and have a lot of grace for and with each other. And thanks for sharing that. So I just want to do a quick review. If you'll give me your little thumbs up on your emoji respond button if you were here last week, that'd be great. If you weren't here, you don't have to put anything. Good. It seems like a lot of folks, almost everyone was here. Good. So we'll just spend a few minutes reviewing the ACEs study. The ACEs study was carried out by Dr. Vincent Folletti and his colleague Stephen Anda in the mid-1990s. And what that study did was it compared the childhood experiences of about 17,000 folks, most living in Southern California, to their adult health and well-being outcomes. And what these doctors found was that folks who reported more adversity in their childhood, so before they were 18, and adversities include things like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical neglect and emotional neglect, things like mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, substance abuse, and then even things we don't necessarily think of as traumas, like divorce or having your biological parent not living with you in the home. These were considered the 10 experiences that they looked at. And what the doctors found was that the more of these that you had in your history, the more vulnerable you are to poor health and well-being outcomes in adulthood. And I know that Keith spent some time talking about other things that were not a part of this study, but that significantly impact kids and their development and growth. And so just a few of those that just can come right off the top of my head are things like food insecurity, not having the food that you need, things like living in a neighborhood where there's a lot of violence and not feeling safe in your home, or living in a place where you are dealing with consistent racism, sexism, and all the other isms, where you are being oppressed. All of these things can be part of the spectrum of trauma and toxic stress. And what we know is that that has an impact on kids and adults, both physically and mentally. And what happened in the study is that the doctors were able to correlate a lot of health and well-being outcomes to these risks, to these ACEs, to these negative traumatic experiences that kids could have. And some of them are very surprising. I don't think it's surprising really to anyone who is in the business of working with people, whether that's in ministry, whether that's in education, whether that's in therapy, that when these things happen in our lives, we often turn to things like smoking, alcohol, and drug use to numb that out. That makes a lot of sense. And so I think most people are not shocked by that. However, when we look at the health impact of these ACEs, this can be incredibly shocking. What we note is that even things that feel so unrelated, like heart disease or stroke or broken bones, can be related to the events that happened in our early childhood. And so what we know is that ACEs, toxic stress, and adversity impacts us not just physically, but also emotionally, in our life potential, and with our mental health. And so without spending a huge amount of time talking about brains and neurology and kind of the nitty gritty of this, I do think it's really important for anyone that works with kids to just have this very basic understanding of the human brain. Because when we think about teaching, and I've spent a good deal of my career teaching in classrooms, but I've also taught a heck of a lot of Sunday school classes and other small groups. And so there are so many times that I wish that I really understood the brain better now that I look back on my history with kids. So we're just going to quickly walk through how the brain develops and what that means to us as teachers and ministers. So our brain develops from the bottom up. And this is both literal and also a metaphor. It also teaches us about the hierarchical way the brain develops, that it goes from the most simple to the most complex. And so before we are even on the planet, while we are still developing in utero, our brain stem is developing. And that is the piece on this graphic that you see is pink. And what you see are these white circles that are down in this pink area. And what these circles represent are some of our basic neurochemistry. The DA stands for dopamine, NE is neuroepinephrine, and SER is serotonin. So what this tells us is that this very primal, old, earliest developing part of the brain helps us to do a couple of things. It helps us just survive because it mediates our temperature, our heart rate, our blood pressure, but it also helps us to create these chemicals that have to do with our well-being. So if you have ever taken or know someone that has taken a medication for depression or anxiety, it's very likely that that medication was a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what that means is that your brain needs more serotonin. That's what helps us to feel well. That's what helps us not to feel depressed. And so the lowest part of the brain mediates all this physical stuff, but also some things that we think of as very complex, like neurochemicals. Then that develops first, even before we are born. And typically the brainstem is pretty well developed by the time that we are given birth to, right? By the time we're on the planet, because we need it to regulate our bodies. The next part of the brain that begins to mature is the diencephalon. And the diencephalon is this part of the brain that takes what's out in the world, it interprets it, it categorizes it, and then it helps us to respond appropriately to our world. And so this is one of the things that can happen to kids with a lot of trauma, is that this part of the brain can be pretty disorganized. And so they have a lot of trouble responding appropriately to external stimuli. And we're going to talk a bunch about that as we progress through our time together. The next part of the brain that develops is the limbic system. And many of us have sort of heard of the limbic system. The limbic system is all about relationships, affiliation, connection, and emotions. And so this part of the brain develops after these kind of pieces about the body and how we respond to our world develop. And then the final part of the brain to develop is the cortex. And the cortex is all about logic, insight, and reason. And everyone here who works with kids or youth, we would be all so excited if all of our kids had a well-developed, healthy, functional cortex, because we all love logic, insight, and reason. Logic, insight, and reason in children looks something like, Bob punched Roy in the arm, and we say to Bob, dude, why did you do that? And if Bob has logic, insight, and reason, he can say, I was mad at Roy because he said something I didn't like. But the truth is, kids, particularly kids with trauma histories, don't have well-developed cortexes. Our cortex doesn't fully develop until we're in our mid-20s, right? And so what we get from kids is when we say, Bob, why did you punch Roy? He goes, I don't know. And that's true. They really don't have a lot of logic, a lot of insight, and a lot of reason. And then when we think about teenagers, we are expecting them to make so many big decisions. They have so many big decisions to make. And it's important that they be able to make prudent decisions. However, developmentally, teens just don't have a well-developed cortex, which explains a lot of the silly and just pretty nonsensical things that teenagers do and say, right? It has to do with their brain. And so if a child has a lot of adversity early in life, it impacts these pink and yellow parts of the brain. And we all know the song about the wise man, right? He built his house on a rock. If you are building your house on a firm, solid foundation, the rest of it is going to be firm and solid, right? If you have a house with a solid foundation, you can patch the roof and be done with it. That's a pretty simple fix. It may be costly, but it's much less costly than fixing the foundation of a house, right? And so kids with early adversity often have these really shaky neural foundations. And so we're going to talk today about what are some things we can do to help kids who come to us really with a brain and with a cortex that's been built upon sand, that's been built upon a pretty unhealthy foundation. This particular image, and I'm not sure if Keith showed this or not, but I love showing this image for a couple of reasons. One is because I think it just makes it easy for us to understand. But two, because this image, this actual image, created a transformation in my own life. So I parent 4 kids, as I said before, who all came to me through foster care. They all came from different backgrounds, but none of their backgrounds were very healthy. And when they came to me, I only had the experience with parenting of my own parents. And I only had the experience of parenting or working with kids through my own education and through the kids I was around. And the majority of that is based on kids with pretty healthy brains that were well nurtured, well developed, and cared for in really healthy, enriching ways. And so when my first couple of kids came to me through foster care, I felt like a total failure because nothing that I did seemed to be working for them. The way that I tried to discipline them didn't seem to be working. In fact, there's actually a time that we were at church and one of my kids was like acting so crazy. And I just said, I need you to stop or whatever. It was very just pretty typical type of redirection. And that kid just turned around and glared at me and said, "Who are you, white lady?" And I thought in that moment, oh gosh, who am I? This kid has been with me for 2 weeks. Who am I to them? Right? There is so much to unpack when we think about trauma, when we think about not having relationships with kids. Who really was I? Because I'll tell you that this is a totally true story. I remember very clearly sitting in the front, which is where the youth sat in the church that I grew up with, sitting beside my high school boyfriend. We are chit-chatting and writing notes to each other. And I suddenly feel a presence behind me. I feel it. I don't even have to see it. I feel it. That presence was my father. And all he had to do was get up from where he was sitting and come and sit behind me, and immediately my behavior changed. There was nothing in me that would have turned around and said, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" I knew exactly why he was there. It's because I was misbehaving. I was making poor choices, and he was there to ensure that those choices didn't continue, right? But I had a long history with him. I had 16 years to know what his expectations were, how I was supposed to behave, what it needed to look like. And just his presence was enough of a discipline to make me stop doing something inappropriate, right? And so those are two very different groups of kids. And we will be working in our ministries and in our work with kids from both of those groups, kids who have a history of nurturing and kids who really have not had that. So here's how this image shifted my whole mindset. So in parenting these kids where nothing was working, I was shown this image. And what we see on the left where it says healthy brain is a PET scan. And a PET scan measures electrical activity in certain areas of the brain. And in these two white circles, we see the temporal lobes. And this is a part of the limbic system and the cortex here. So this is about how we interpret information, how we have logic, insight, and reason, and use our emotions to make certain choices. And we see in this healthy 3-year-old, there is a lot of activity going on there. Now we know the limitations of a 3-year-old, but the brain of this kiddo that says healthy brain can do all the logic, insight, and reason of any healthy 3-year-old, right? And then we look at the second brain. And this brain is of a child who has been neglected. This particular child lived in an Eastern European orphanage where those kids are pretty much given their meals, maybe a small amount of human contact, but nothing enriching, nothing relational, nothing sensory. They don't get to have a full, rich experience that we would want an infant or child to have. And in these same circles, in these temporal lobes, in this area of the brain that mediates things like logic and understanding direction and making behavioral shifts, we do not see these bright colors. We do not see red and orange. What we see is very little activity. The neglect and abuse that this child has gone through has physically changed the way that this child's brain functions. So when I saw this image, I had no choice but to go, oh, who needs to change today is not my kid, it's me. I've got to do better for him. I've got to do better for her. I've got to do something different on their behalf. Because what we know is that the brain can grow and change. And if this 3-year-old is coming to sit in your church programs, if this 3-year-old is coming to sit in your Sunday school class, they have a very different capacity than the other 3-year-old. And what we can do is we can shift our practices to meet that child where they are until they gain the skills and the knowledge and the understanding and the brain capacity to be a different kid. And so again, this to me shows us not that it's hopeless, not that something awful is going to happen, but it shows us that this kid needs a lot of assistance. Can you guys still hear me okay? Great. So how does this impact communities of faith? How does this impact us? Typically what we see are two areas where trauma behaviors come out. It comes out in behavioral challenges, and I know that you guys heard a bit about that last time, and it also comes out in unmet relational needs. So just again, you can look over some of these behavior issues that we often see in kids with a lot of trauma in their background. Stuff that makes it hard for us to teach a group, right? Oppositional behavior, being having difficulty self-regulating, not trusting authorities, not having good, healthy boundaries. So these behaviors are often symptoms of trauma. It doesn't mean that they're okay. Adults must have boundaries, but boy, when we know and when we look at these behaviors as this is a symptom of something different, this is a symptom of this child's trauma instead of this kid is a real piece of work, it changes how we interact with kids. And then when we think about relational challenges that our kids have, they're often like this little boy. They come into our worship service, they come into our Sunday school class, and we are attempting to connect, and they're like, nope, get away, right? They push us away. And this happens because for many of these children, their history of relational interactions has been very negative. And so for them, the idea of relationships is very frightening and very unsafe. And we can just really sum up this graphic in 2 words, or about 3, right? Poor relationships make people scared, right? Poor relationships make people scared. And so when kids have had these bad relationships, they find it very challenging to trust other adults. And this makes a lot of sense to us. But again, if we are looking at it through the idea of, well, they can choose to stop, what we have to remember is these are kids that will need a bunch of healthy relational interactions before they stop protecting themselves, right? And so our role is to help mitigate these poor behaviors and to help enrich kids and families' unmet relational needs. So what do we do with all of that? That's the big question. For me, understanding the why helps me to persevere with the how. If I don't know why I'm doing something, I find it very difficult to continue doing it when it gets hard. And so having that foundation really is going to help us stay with it, because these techniques are not magic bullets. What they are ways for us to understand kids better and put them on a better, more level playing field. So we're going to look at how we can help. The first way we can help is simply by being compassionate. If we look at behavior as something that a child is always fully in control of, it is very difficult to be compassionate. This doorbell is here because I parented a child for several years who every time the doorbell would ring, they would lose their mind. Like literally this kid would climb bookshelves, dodge under furniture, would just scream. One time went into our bathroom and wrapped themselves up in the shower curtain, pulled the whole thing off the wall, just went nuts. And literally, I tried all the things that I thought were typical ways to discipline a child. I took things away, I fussed at them, I didn't let them have privileges, I made them go to timeout, because what I saw was the behavior. I didn't see that it was related to trauma. I didn't have much compassion for it because frankly, the behavior was bothering me. It was annoying, it made life difficult. But when I had compassion, what I discovered was that behavior is related to something much deeper. That behavior was related to years of being in a home where every time the doorbell rang, bad stuff went down, right? It gave me the sense of compassion. So the first thing that we can do is simply have compassion for kids with behavioral challenges. None of them wake up in the morning thinking, I can't wait to make my Sunday school teacher's life miserable. I can't wait to ruin that lesson for them. That's not what happens. They come to us, and typically they are reacting to the environment around them through their lens of trauma. And so the first thing we can do is be compassionate. The second way that we can help is through co-regulation. And co-regulation simply means that we regulate alongside the child. So I distilled this down to a really simple way of thinking about it. An out-of-control adult cannot help an out-of-control child. And if you're a parent, you already know this is true, right? That when your kids have pushed your buttons to the point that you're totally out of control, you're over it, you're done, you know that there's no way in that moment you can shepherd your child back to calm. And so a way that we can help kids is to remain calm, to be as regulated as we can as the adult, to provide that stable, reassuring leadership that even though you're out of control, I am not. I am still okay, and I am here to help you move back to a place of being okay. And sometimes this will require some changes, maybe in the way we do programming. So if you know, for instance, you have a child in one of your classrooms or programs that really struggles with behavior, you may need some extra adult hands there so that someone can help regulate that kiddo, can help them to stay regulated while the other person is doing instruction, right? So this requires sometimes a little bit of shifting around and thinking about not how can I make this kid stop, but how can I help them to be more in control? So co-regulation and compassion are two of the just foundational ways that we can make changes in our programs. We also need to create structure. And this is particularly challenging, I think, for many youth ministries because we want to do a lot of really fun things. We want to do a lot of like letting the kids lead, which is perfect, and we need to do that. But we need to do that with structure. Structure helps us to feel safe. Knowing what's going to happen next helps us feel safe. The majority of you who answered in the chat box said, your thorn is not knowing what's going to happen. And so when we think of that from the perspective of a traumatized child coming into maybe a Sunday school class or a program and just having no idea what this is even about, how frightening that could be. One of my foster kids came to stay with us for quite a while, and we took them to church, and after about the second time, they were just like, I am not going in that Sunday school room. And they literally like held on with their fingers to the door frame, just not doing it. And I didn't handle it super well. I felt really overwhelmed. I felt embarrassed. And I was just like, get in there, just get in there. I was having a hard time being compassionate. But after that happened, maybe two weeks in a row, I was like, I got to take a different approach, right? And so I started doing a little inquiry. And I said, tell me what happens in there. And this kid who was about 5.5 had never been to church before, but now was living with me as the foster family, a church family from way back. This felt like second nature to me, particularly like this was the denomination I grew up in. All this felt very normal. This 5.5-year-old said, we just go in this room and they say the names of these books, and they have a big book, and I don't know what it is. And I thought about that. I analyzed that, not from the perspective of, oh my gosh, everyone is looking at my kid screaming outside the Sunday school room, but how incredibly frightening to be put in a room with other people and other kids who know what's going to happen, and who know this big book, and who know these weird names, and I do not. And I don't know what's happening at all, right? That's a very scary situation and scenario, and not one that I would have knowingly put any child in. But we can help through creating structure. What that structure may mean is just answering some questions, right? Answering questions. Is our time with the child predictable? Do the kids and youth do the same thing every time? If they don't, is there some way we can make that happen, right? One of the things that, after figuring out what this kiddo needed, was saying to the teacher at the beginning of class, can you just pretty much do a rundown of what happens in class? Can you say, so first we're going to do a memory verse, then we're going to do Bible drills, then I'm going to tell you about a story, then we're going to watch Veggie Tales. Just that much would have been very helpful in alleviating some of that anxiety of not knowing what's next. Making charts that show what happens during class time, having pictures on the wall of the teachers with their names and pictures with of what's going to happen next, having the materials kind of all laid out so that the kids can see. So we're going to use these puppets first, then we're going to play this game, and then we're going to color. Just allowing the kids to understand this is going to be predictable. Every time we're going to do the same thing. It's going to be safe every time. Can be incredibly helpful. Now, with older kids, we do want a lot of that fun factor and novelty factor to happen. However, it still needs to be safe and predictable. And so what can we do to ensure that? You know, we can talk ahead of time. If we know there's a new kid who's maybe never had these experiences, just go to them personally and say, hey, I'm so glad to meet you, which I feel like all churches are so good at that part. Like, we're so excited that you're here. Let me just tell you a little bit about what we do in youth group. First, we are going to do some singing, and usually we do that here. Then we're going to play some games, and we have a playground outside, right? So just really making that time together predictable. Have we ensured that the kids' physical needs are met? Making sure that we offer restroom breaks, that there are snacks for kids that may need them, that they have the ability to get water, that they're comfortable. This can be so reassuring for kids with traumatic pasts. Right? Do they know what's going to happen next, which is what we talked about with that predictability? Just giving information about what is next really freely. Because novelty is frightening. New things are frightening. And for a lot of us who maybe have grown up in the church, we've grown up in specific denominations, we've grown up in specific congregations, these things feel really normal to us. I mean, it feels very typical to do these this progression of things. But for someone who's never been there, or this is new, letting them know what's next will be really important. Is waiting and unstructured time kept to a minimum? Any time that I do consultations or work with a school group or a program, the first thing that I look at is, when do the kids misbehave? And 95% of the time, the misbehaviors occur when the kids don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And so they just start acting out, or they begin, get anxious and nervous. And so is that waiting and unstructured time kept to a minimum? If you know there's a time that kids will need to be waiting, are there things that they can do? You know, there's always the old standby of coloring, having a lot of fidgets, doing Play-Doh, puzzles. Even for older kids, having fidgets for them to play around with and mess around with, that kind of thing helps with off-track behavior. Also, our physical environment can create a sense of comfort. Showing kids where to be and where to sit, where it's appropriate to be, can be so helpful. I think of a time I took my son to Vacation Bible School, and he had all these challenges. He was the kid that makes your Sunday school class hard, and I'm sorry for that. But he really needed to know where he could sit. So we went into VBS, and it literally was in the gym, and kids were just running all around. And it was very loud and very chaotic. And he just, the minute he saw it, he just started screaming. And I was like, this is not going to work for him. He needs a place to sit. So while some kids can totally handle that, and you may want to give them that freedom, think about, are there options for kids who this is too much for? Are there chairs for kids who just can't sit on the gym floor? Like, that is just too much for them. It's hard for them to sit on a floor. It's hard for them to know where their body is in space. Can we have chairs for them? Can we have yoga mats, or just something to mark out? Hey, this is the space for your body. It also makes it very easy to redirect, because you can say things like, oh goodness, Michael needs to be on his own mat, right? Instead of over there touching a friend. So creating these physical spaces where kids know where they should be. We can also help when we create calm through sensory activities. And so this is where we refer back to our brain model. So remember that diencephalon, that second layer of the brain, the yellow part of the brain, that's the part of our brain that takes in sensory input. So what we see, hear, smell, all of that, takes it in, it organizes it, it breaks it down, and then it helps us to behave in certain ways. So when we talk about sensory integration, what we're talking about is the way our nervous system takes in messages from our senses and then turns them into motor and behavioral responses. The easiest way to illustrate this is thinking about using your cast iron skillet and you forget, and you don't have a towel wrapped around it, and you grab that. So an appropriate motor response would be to just let go, right? You would let go of that thing, it's hot. And an appropriate behavioral response would be to maybe scream or shake your hand or cradle your hand, right? That's all due to your healthy sensory integration system. So this is what healthy sensory integration systems look like. We take that information in and we respond in really understandable ways. However, one of the things that trauma can do is create dysfunction in the sensory integration system. And so what happens is, for kids with less functional or dysfunctional sensory integration systems, they take in this information and they try to sort and organize it, but their brain isn't good at it. And so their motor and behavioral responses don't seem to make sense. And a great illustration of this is that same kiddo, that same son of mine. We're sitting in church, and everyone is singing. We had congregational singing, and to me, it is beautiful. It's one of the things that I love most about church is the music. And he is probably about 6 years old, and he's standing on the pew just shaking and covering his ears and just making a lot of noise. So I take him out, and I'm like, dude, what's wrong? What happened? And he said, it feels like needles in my ears. So what I perceived as something beautiful, as something comforting, as something that I look forward to about my church, the singing, my sensory system is just taking that in and going, I love this. His sensory system was taking that in. And because of his previous trauma, abuse, and neglect, was like, oh, this feels terrible. He hated it. It was causing him distress. And that's because it happens right there in the diencephalon. So what we see in kids with sensory issues often looks like bad behavior, right? It looks like my son standing on the pew having a meltdown. But what it really was sensory challenges. So where I'm at, we are having a terrible thunderstorm. I am hoping that nothing happens to our power here. But if for some reason we have a power flash, stay on and I will hop back on. I just want to warn you in case, in case I jump like I just did, or in case the power goes out as thunder. So sensory issues that look like bad behavior can be kids that are fidgety and can't sit still. Kids that just bump into everything, that touch everything. They may look really clumsy or like they can't connect. Kids that are talking really loudly or talking really quietly, or kids that do things like put things in their mouth. So they chew on everything, they touch everything. Kids that need to touch people, different textures, even if it's not socially acceptable. So again, that's my son. If we sat behind you in church and you had on a beautiful velvet jacket, he would definitely be rubbing your back the whole time, even if I had instructed him, no, that's not acceptable. These are kids who are often unable to tolerate things like bright lights and loud noises. They complain a lot about different smells or sounds or textures or tastes. They get really revved up or they zone out in chaotic environments. This is a big one that I see often. So these are the kids who you play a really fun getting to know you game, and maybe it was loud and you've done some big activity, and now everybody else is like winding down and going to sit down for the devotional, but that kid is still all over the place. They cannot get their bodies back down to baseline. Or everybody else is like participating and being part of this fun, loud, chaotic excitement, and the kid is just sitting there staring at the wall, like they cannot participate. It's just too much for them. These are the kids that will bother you the whole hour, complaining about the tag in the back of their shirt, or keep taking their shoes off, even when you've said, please leave your shoes on, because their clothing feels irritating to them. They often have meltdowns when they're overwhelmed. They do a lot of attempts to regulate themselves by doing things with their hands, covering their ears, things that we might think of as being rude. And they're often distracted by things that don't seem distracting to others. So something like a fan may be bothering them, when for most of us with healthy sensory systems, we just kind of push that to the background, right? We don't even hear the ceiling fans. We don't even hear the sounds of the fluorescent lights. But kids with very sensitive sensory systems, say that 3 times, often are very disturbed by those things. So what are some ways that we can make this work for them? How can we help them by changing the environment? Well, we can look at sensory friendly seating, right? So things like you see at the top, there's a young lady sitting on a cushion. That's a perfect way to just delineate, like, here is a seat, right? We put these cushions down, we put yoga mats down, and the kids can all sit on those. We have things besides just a chair. So we have something like a yoga ball for the kids to sit on, a wobble stool. I think the blue disc here that you see the little fella sitting on, this is called a Dynadisc. And this gives the child the ability to sort of move in this 360 way, but they're still seated in their chair. Even using things like the rubber bands to bounce their feet on can really change how a child behaves when they are overloaded with sensory input. So the one that says freedom to move, I really love these stools. And I have honestly seen them be used in ways that changed kids' lives. I was working at a program where they just switched out some of their chairs with those stools. And they sent me a text and said, this child has never sat in a seat ever, and he's finally sitting down. And so this kid was constantly getting in trouble in this program because he just could not sit still. But being able to use this tool allowed him to meet the needs of the class and the teacher, but also meet his own needs. Things like fidgets. So we see these timers with the little water dripping down, having just some little tools like that. Some of these things that kids can look for little items inside the beads. This is actually my son. You see him once, probably when he's 14, and then this little picture he's probably 10, doing his homework, pushing this little squishy ball up against his face, using Theraputty or sand, small sand boxes, these little mesh fidgets that you see close to our Harmony Man at the bottom there. And then even using things like gum or crunchy snacks as a way to engage the sensory system. That can be really helpful for kids. I know that because of COVID, this will probably need to shift a bit. But things like particularly the water timers, gum, the water timers can be easily sanitized. The ball, like the rubber ball, can easily be sanitized. Things like sand can be sanitized, but you may want to hold off until we're less worried about the transfer of germs. But I don't want you to write this off and be like, with COVID, we can't do this stuff. There are definitely ways to do it. And so many kinds of hard plastic fidgets that can be put in a dishwasher and sanitized or just sprayed with Lysol or bleach solution to be sanitized. So common sensory triggers, some of the things that often set kids off that have sensory issues are things like loud noises, things like singing, the band at church, a loud clap of thunder. There's any kind of very loud sound can be a major sensory trigger. So the solution that we found for my son was he actually wears little headphones like that folks use for hunting. So they dampen the noise, but they don't cut it out. So he can still hear voices. He can still hear singing, but it like takes out the highs and the lows. And those are incredibly accessible. I think we bought them at Walmart, Sam's Club, like literally $6. So again, for some of the programs that I do more specific consulting, I have them buy just like 10 or 15 pairs, keep them in a basket somewhere that everyone knows where they are. And if there's a kid that needs those, that they can offer them to a child. We never want to make them do it, particularly if we're frustrated with them. It's not like we want to say, put those headphones on and stop, right? But just offering that, hey, it seems like this really bothers you. Let's see what happens when you have on the headphones, or let's see what happens when you move to the back with Miss Kendall where it's not so loud. Maybe you can help back there. So just offering ways to mitigate these kind of loud sounds and loud noises. Other common sensory triggers are things like being crowded, being in a space where you don't know where your body is supposed to be, or being touched by a stranger, being touched without warning. And so thinking, is this when this kid behaves like that, right? Then maybe what I can do is shift the environment instead of just telling this kid for the 100,000th time, don't touch your friend, right? So looking at these kind of sensory triggers, looking at when odd or strange or poor behaviors happen can help you to create a plan for changing the environment or just looking for some other type of intervention. So how do we help? We use our compassion, we co-regulate, we create structure, we do calm sensory activities, but we can also calm through movement. In churches and Sunday school classes and youth programs are really good at this already and use this already. However, when we can be more mindful of it, we can leverage movement to really be something that can help with behavior challenges. So when we think about movement, church is the best, Sunday school is the best for adding hand movements to songs, right? We use that all the time as a way to connect, as a way to have kids be active, but still participating in learning. Moving during transitions. So one of the things that always kills me as a teacher, as a trainer, is when I see people attempting to have a group of kids walk down the hall totally silently with their mouths closed, with their hands like down, because it works for about 30 seconds. And then inevitably somebody does something that cascades down the whole line. So for me, it's like, that's not even the way I'm going to try to get kids to walk down a hall, is silently and with their hands by their sides like soldiers, right? We can add movement during a transition. So as we walk down the hall, Miss Allison's Sunday school class is going to do mouse claps. So we're going to clap our little fingers so quietly, only the mice can hear it, right? We're going to do it really quietly. This, again, we add movement during transitions. When we transition to a new activity, we can have the kids do some kind of little movement, whether it's just something with their hands, whether they are tiptoeing, whether they are taking giant steps or walking like an old person, or doing a sloth walk. That's currently my favorite, is I have the kids do sloth walking, which is very slow, right? So we move as slowly as we can. That is much more doable and sustainable than attempting to get every kid like in line at the same moment. But I can get them all to be playful at the same moment, and we can move in that way. To add movements to lessons, right? And so if we are teaching a lesson and we are talking about David and Goliath, every time that I say 5 smooth stones, you need to show me your smooth stone, right? So making this hand motion. Right? Every time we talk about Samson, we need to show our hair. Like, let's show our long hair, right? So adding movement to a lesson, it helps kids to regulate the brain and stay engaged at the same time. And giving brain breaks, just giving them a few seconds. So maybe if you're transitioning between doing an activity and then going into snack time or the next activity, have them do a quick brain break. These can be as simple as standing on one foot for 10 seconds and then switching, or say, come on, okay, we're gonna give ourselves a hand massage. We're gonna just take a second to massage our hands while we switch over to our next activity. Just see how that feels, right? So you're engaging the body and the brain at the same time. To have them do something like, okay, before we start our game, let's squeeze our fists. We're gonna squeeze 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and release. Oh, how does that feel, right? And then go back into a brain break. Something like pushing the palms together, release and repeat. So just giving a little bit of a movement break. This will help so much with those kids who have a hard time staying seated, who have a hard time staying focused. If we think back to the brain, what somatic or body movement does is it engages that diencephalon. And so it helps to regulate the body. Movement is very regulating to the body. Breathing activities are really great for a group of dysregulated kids. You can do something like square breathing, which is super simple. You just use the palm of your hand as your visual. And so you breathe in to the count of 4 while you trace the top, out, in, out. Right, so you can use your hand as the way to do square breathing. But this one is actually my favorite. So in this breathing technique, you still use your hand. And I've seen this work wonders with teens and tweens who have just done something like, let's say, have a volleyball game, and now you are trying to get everybody back to do your devotional. And so after doing this big, exciting activity, now you're asking them to come and sit down and be quiet. So what we did is after the activity, we then are like, all right, we did a great job. Thank you. You did good. We're going to go do the devotional. While we're moving over there, let's just use our hand and do some breathing. So we're going to go in and then out as we trace down, out, in, out as we trace down, right? And you can do this the whole hand. If you do one way and then the next way, I guarantee you will have some pretty regulated kids because that kind of breathing engages our parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the part of the brain, that's the part of the nervous system that helps us to rest and relax. And so doing breathing exercises, a lot of deep breathing, and particularly long exhales, really regulates, really helps us to rest and relax. So just leveraging what we know about the brain to help kids get back on track. I do this with my own children all the time. So even when I've messed up, so if I did not respond great or very well to something that one of my kids does or says in the classroom or at home, I might say, oh no, I wish that I'd done that different. Like, let's do a reset. Why don't we take 3 deep breaths and then a big exhale and then go back to what we were doing before. Or now we can start to color, right? So using breath as a way to regulate. The cross hug, and I don't know if you noticed, I'm gonna go back. This says a simple down regulating activity. So down regulating means that we are calming our bodies. Up regulating means we're getting more energy. One of the things that youth programs do really well is a lot of up-regulating activities. Those happen a lot. And they're really fun and they're really good for kids, and they help tons with relationships because we're doing a lot of laughing and a lot of connecting. However, if we simply upregulate and then leave kids in that place and then ask them, all right, now I need you to do something really calm and quiet, we've revved up the nervous system and not given it anywhere to go. And so that's why these down regulating activities are helpful. The cross hug, I love this one, just crossing the hands, and then you can either tap one shoulder at a time, or you can do both. And I like to do this particularly with younger children while we sing. So I may be singing them a song while we tap to the rhythm. This is incredibly regulating, and it uses rhythm to regulate the body. So if we just played on the playground and now we're coming inside, we may sing and do a cross hug as we calm down to start instruction. So we use our calming techniques through sensory activity, calming through movement, and then we can also help kids with trauma histories through connection and relational safety. And again, this is something that the faith community does really well with, creating those connections, creating relational safety. And when we understand just how powerful that is, then we can leverage that even more to help kids and families who are struggling. So when we think about connection and relational safety, one of the things that we need to do is really avoid harsh discipline, harsh reaction, harsh punitive ways of being with kids. One of the things that I consistently refer back to and think back to is a book called The Connected Child. And that book was written by Karen Purvis, and she was a researcher and clinician out of Texas Christian University. And her work is heavily faith-based and heavily based in science. And so it is just this beautiful marriage of the church and what we know about the brain, and how when we put that together, we can create healing experiences for kids and families. And Dr. Purvis uses the phrase, connect before you correct. And she uses it over and over and over again. Connect before you correct. We do not hear correction. We do not hear criticism from people we're not connected to in the same way that we hear correction and criticism from the people that we are connected to. And so when we use these harsh disciplines and harsh reactions with children, teens who have been traumatized, but are not well connected to them, they see you as the enemy, not as someone with their best interest in mind. And so it is very important that we make those connections and just avoid these really harsh ways of responding to kids. It's important to remember that hurt kids and hurt adults as well often have a really skewed worldview. They have a belief system that may be quite different than the belief system of the majority of your church leadership and even your congregation. They may believe that the world is just inherently bad and out to get them, right? They typically, many of our kids believe that adults do not have their best interest in mind, that adults only want to punish them or to be mean to them, and that they don't really care what happens to them. And while this isn't true, it is helpful for us to engage with curiosity and empathy instead of judgment, right? It's very easy to sort of judge those kids, particularly those teens and tweens, and say, hey, you really need to respect Pastor Bob. You really need to respect him because he is doing a lot of good for you and all these other kids. But that child, in their worldview, just sees adults do what's best for them, and adults do things that are harmful to children. So why should I trust him just because I've been to this church 3 times, right? And so when we engage in empathy and curiosity, I wonder why. Why does he lack this trust? What causes this child to behave in this way? Instead of judgment, we will create these beautiful connections and relationships. I often think of this image, which is, what we see in kids, youth, are their behaviors. And those behaviors are the tip of the iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg. What's driving those behaviors? What's driving the way that this child may talk to me is so much more deeper, and it's so much more complex than we may know. And so just be willing to look underneath the surface a bit and not just assume this kid's just a disrespectful jerk. Kind of hope they don't come back. But think, what could be the real meat of what's going on here? We need to remember that relationships matter, that we only really learn when we feel safe and valued. We only learn when we feel safe and valued. And so we could have created the most amazing Sunday school curriculum on the planet. We can have the most wonderful youth group plan that's ever been made. But if those kids don't feel safe and they don't feel valued, it's not going to be effective, right? It's not going to be effective. We change lives when we create strong and healthy relationships. And then looking at this bottom bullet point, we must provide patient, persistent, parallel relational support, right? Relationships don't happen overnight. And even with children, they just take time. We need that time. And so we can provide that patient and persistent support. We can provide a lot of parallel support. And this may be really new to many of you. This was a real new concept to me in the last few years, because I had always been taught the way that you connect and the way you interact is you get down on the child's level and you look at their face and they look at yours, and you have this interaction that's very meaningful and big. But what happens with kids who have trauma is that really pushes the boundaries, right? They cannot do that. And so for kids that have a lot of relational challenges, for kids that don't seem to be responding well to that, another way to approach it, a better way and a more effective way, is parallel. So instead of coming face to face, you come alongside, literally. You come alongside them. So sitting next to a kid on the pew and just sort of having this conversation where you definitely look at them, right? You're going to make some eye contact, but where you're not in this real intense face-to-face intimate stance is going to create a lot more trust in that child. And so being parallel, just going and sitting beside a kid, just walking alongside. For a kid that's having a hard time connecting with the group, hey, you want to take a walk with me? I'm just going down here to get some stuff. Walking side by side can create that relational support and trust that's really hard for many kids. For those of you who are parents, or particularly parents of teens, you may have noticed or may remember that riding in the car with your teenager, you get a lot more information out of them than when you sit across the table from them and start drilling, like what happened, where were you, when was this, right? There is this comfort in not having to be so intimate. not having to just be making eye contact with someone while you're getting to know them or while you're sharing hard, heavy stuff. And so that parallel support can be a real game changer for many folks working with kids. We use the work of Dr. Perry in our agency and in our training. And this quote just consistently stands out to me as being helpful, meaningful, and true. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely they will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change. And no one should know this and do this better than the faith community. We know that relationships are the agents of change, right? And so when we can support kids relationally, we are really giving them an amazing way to be resilient, an amazing way to shift their behaviors. And so creating these healthy relationships is one of the best ways that you can help a child to connect. So when we think about putting all of this into practice, what we want to do is to be compassionate, right? To look deeper, to know what's going on there, to create this sense of safety in kids, to co-regulate with them, to not let them get us off our game, to make these environments where they can move, where they can have sensory interaction, where they feel like their bodies are safe and regulated. We want to create these healthy, strong relationships. And so just trying these techniques, adding something new in, I think you will see some really beautiful little changes that make it easier to make these big shifts. And so I think we have about 7 or 8 minutes. I am so happy to answer questions if anybody has questions, or if you just have thoughts. I would love to hear those. And I'm going to go first to the chat and see what folks have written, but then feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. I see one of the questions is, what about teens who are too cool to do these movement activities? Absolutely. And I love that Kendall has answered. For older kids and teens, it's pretty trendy to practice these popular dance moves, and they're appropriate. And letting them do that. I've had kids, what did she say? I've had kids in Sunday school make a cartoon clip about the story or use paint or marker to show a symbol. So you can do movement just through adding something like, hey, let's make a poster that illustrates this. Let's do that in a new way. So there's lots of ways that we can incorporate that. And unfortunately, the main thing is, as an adult that works with teens, you just have to keep trying, because there's always going to be one that's too cool. And sometimes you find out that's the one that needs you the most. So just continuing to try and being your nerdy adult self that just isn't going to give up has a pretty good track record of working too.
What about in our virtual world? Like, even though we limit that as much as possible, how do we kind of help with fidgeting, or to help engage as much as possible in this virtual world?
Yeah, so one of the things you can do is just have activities. I put slides in. Today we just did one where we were typing, but I've had to do some long trainings online, and we've just put in a movement slide where literally we did some type of hand clapping thing. We played a song and just had the kids like move, or we would try something where they would have to mirror each other, which is really fun and silly. So just being creative Just giving a lot of movement breaks too, just saying, all right, we're going to take a 5-second break, get your wiggles out. Doing something like that would be a good way to help. Letting kids stand, just reminding them, I know sitting is hard. If you want to stand, I'm fine with that. Just letting them do that. I just worked with a mom who was so frustrated with her kid because he wouldn't sit in the seat to do virtual work. And I was like, girl, give it up. It's not important. Like, it's not important. Let him stand up. Who cares? Let him lay on the floor on his belly and type with his computer on the floor. You can still learn in a variety of seated positions, unseated positions, in a box, on a train, in a tree, right? Like, you can learn in a variety of ways. We're just used to doing it in one way. And someone asks the million-dollar question, how can I retrain my mind to think of these things first? So this is the hard part, right? What we're doing is countercultural in some ways. It's new, it's different. The way that we do it is by consistently doing it. And so what you will do is you will go into your class with every intention of doing that, and then you will snap your fingers and say, sit down. And immediately you'll go, that's not what I wanted to do. And so the way that I've done this and continue to do it is, that's not really the way I want to engage with you guys. Let's try this again. Would you mind, do you need to take a walk, right? You just fix it. I always know afterwards how I could have done it better. And revisiting that, reflecting on that, and just in the moment shifting and going, that's not what I wanted. I do it with my kids all the time. I was not raised in a way that was remotely like this. So parenting in this way has been challenging. So I often have to go, that's not the way I wanted to talk to you. I know yelling doesn't make you work harder. I'm really sorry. Maybe next time, how could we do this? So, it's just continuing to do it, giving yourself lots of grace. It doesn't come naturally to many of us, even after 10 years of doing this work. There are days that I go, really good at teaching this, really bad at doing it. But then we just try again the next day, right? The mercies are new every morning, and some of us need it every morning. So I'm one of those people, and thankfully I get to try again tomorrow. Any other thoughts or questions?
Allison, what do you do when the rug has been pulled out from under us and it's so hard to keep a schedule because the schedule keeps changing? How do you regulate that a little bit with your children and with any other groups?
Yeah, I think our family has spent a lot of time just talking about how our brains need stability and security. And so this time is making it harder for us to feel safe, and just doing a lot of things that we can, little touchstones that we can keep doing at regular intervals. But this has been really challenging for everyone. So we just spend a lot of time doing regulating activities, doing breathing exercises as a family, spending extra time together, connecting, reaching out to those folks that probably are challenged and are having more of a challenge than others. Is just reaching out and adding that relational piece. I would love to give you like 3 easy steps because I would follow them too. Before I go, do you guys have just a second for Kendall to introduce herself and talk to you about next week? Next 2 weeks.
Hello, I just wanted to pop on and say hi. I'm excited to train with Shanae in a couple of weeks and be with you all for finishing up this series. We're going to be talking about trauma responsive community and just some clinical resources to know about and community resources to know about and what to look for if you do need to refer people. We know that you all probably see lots of different needs coming to your churches. So we want to be able to support you in that and looking for resources.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Allison, thank you so much. This has
You're
been
welcome.
really helpful and practical and things that we can take and do. And so we really, really appreciate that and appreciate you answering questions too. We will be, like we said, we'll archive this so that folks can access it later. And we are really looking forward to the 27th with Kendall and Sinead and helping us to learn even more. So I hope you all have a great day. If it is raining and storming like it is at my house and it is at Allison's, I hope you all will be safe out there, and we look forward to seeing you the week after next. Thanks.
Thank you.